G'day everybody, my name is Lowell and welcome to the channel. So we have a video for us today, turned up in my feed and I thought, you know what, let's have a look at this. This will be interesting. The evolution of the White House explained from 1792 to 2025. So let's jump. Now, the only thing I know about the White House, obviously it's in Washington, D.C. I think it burnt down at one stage. I don't know who burnt it down. And I think they whitewashed it. Is that why it's called the White House? Maybe I'm getting my history mixed up. I don't know, but I'm sure we're about to find out. So let's jump in and let's have a look at this one. Let me just do that full screen so we can actually see it. Let's have a look.
So recently, President Trump has commissioned the construction of a $250 million ballroom at the White House.
Oh,
this has resulted in the facade of the East Wing being torn down, a section of the building that was originally constructed in 1902 during Theodore Roosevelt's administration, and significantly expanded upon during Franklin Roosevelt's in 1942. I've seen plenty of people inside and outside the history community with wildly varying opinions on this construction project. If you're looking for partisan commentary on it, this is not the right place for you. Instead, I want to take a look at the history behind one of America's most iconic buildings and explain not only the origins of the White House, but also touch upon other major modifications made to it over the years. We're mainly going to be looking at the larger construction projects it's undergone. If I went through every esoteric detail each president changed about the residence, we'd be here all day. Either way, I think you'll be surprised at just how many changes the White House has seen in its 225-year history.
I'm assuming 225. Even normal houses changed at that time, but I'm assuming with every new president or every so often they obviously have ideas to add stuff. So, but okay, let's jump in. Let's have a look.
Surprised at just how many changes the White House has seen in its 225-year history. Our first president, George Washington, played an instrumental role in the creation of the White House, but never actually lived in it himself. He instead originally resided in New York City, first in the Walter Franklin House, then the Alexander Macomb House. The nation's
Washington never lived in the White House? Already learning stuff. Okay.
Resided in New York City, first in the Walter Franklin House, then the Alexander Macomb House. The nation's capital was then moved to Philadelphia, and for the rest of his presidency, Washington lived in the fittingly named President's House. These were always meant to be temporary accommodations for the chief executive. In 1790, the Residence Act was passed, which established Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital, a compromise location.
That's why. Okay, I understand why now. Okay, that makes more sense.
Act was passed, which established Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital, a compromise location between northern and southern states. George Washington personally oversaw the project, alongside future President Thomas Jefferson and planner Pierre Charles L'Enfant. By 1791, the site for the White House was chosen. An Irish-born architect, James Hoban, won a design competition for the building organized by Jefferson with a $500 prize. The design was heavily inspired by the Leinster House in Dublin, Ireland, with some amendments suggested by Washington himself. There's even some Roman design motifs invoked, a consistent theme with federal government buildings and memorials in Washington, D.C. We have some surviving early drawings of the White House by Hoban, but none are believed to be from the actual design competition itself. The cornerstone of the White House was laid on October 13th, 1792, and an ambitious 8-year construction period began. By the year 1800, construction was nearly complete. Due to budgetary and material constraints, the building was significantly smaller than originally planned by L'Enfant. George Washington had passed away the year prior, with John Adams as the currently sitting president. The Adams family moved to the almost finished residence in 1800, with the president...
The Adams family. Oh, man. Automatically wrong type of Adams family. Okay.
As the currently sitting president. The Adams family moved to the almost finished residence in 1800, with the president giving the blessing, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." However, Adams' residency wouldn't last too long, with Thomas Jefferson defeating him in the election of 1800 and moving into the White House in March of 1801 after he was inaugurated. Jefferson was the first president to significantly expand the White House, adding colonnades on the east and west sides of the building. These colonnades were implemented to facilitate staff movement, concealing operations of laundry, storing ice, coal, and wood, and even including a stable. If you think President Trump's creation of a ballroom was the first time a White House modification had been controversial, you would be wrong. Even over 200 years ago, Jefferson had plenty of critics arguing the colonnades were too costly and extravagant, and went against the idea that an American president should demonstrate humility. Nevertheless, the colonnades remained for centuries to come, with some modifications over the years, but largely unchanged from their original form. They were later later used to connect the east and west wings to the White House itself. Today, the West Colonnade features a gallery of presidential portraits installed by the Trump administration, and the East Colonnade was recently demolished as part of the ballroom project. The next major modification to the White House came in 1814, where it, along with significant portions of Washington, D.C., was burned down during the War of 1812. The exterior walls were left mostly intact, but most of the interior and furnishings were sadly destroyed. Many artifacts and objects were taken from the White House as a result, but there is a famous story about Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison, rescuing this portrait of George Washington. After the White House was sacked, President Madison had to move out to 2 alternative residences in the city during the Reconstruction process, which lasted from 1814 to 1817. Remember James Hoban, the architect who won the design competition? He was rehired by Madison to rebuild the White House to its original design, despite suggestions from some lawmakers that the residence should be moved elsewhere. Shortcuts had to be made to finish Reconstruction in 3 years, including reusing some of the damaged walls from the fire, which would become a problem much later down the line. The following president, James Monroe, also made a major change to the White House, once again involving the design input of original architect James Hoban. He added the south portico, one of the most iconic features of the building that still exists today. An important distinction to make is that the balcony midway up the portico, known as the Truman balcony, did not exist until over a century later. This painting from the 1860s shows what the portico would have looked like without the Truman balcony present. If you're wondering what that building is to the left, don't worry, we'll get to it soon. The South Portico was completed in 1824, the final full year of the Monroe presidency. Like his father, the 6th president, John Quincy Adams, didn't oversee any significant modifications to the White House itself. However, he did commission the planting of over 700 saplings consisting of 25 different tree species to create the White House's first arboretum. The same cannot be said for Quincy's successor, Andrew Jackson. Jackson ordered the construction of the North Portico, another extremely iconic part of the White House that I was honestly surprised to learn was not there from the beginning. This construction project was overseen by, you guessed it, James Hoban, who was now well into his 70s. Jackson, like plenty of other presidents, faced significant criticism for this project, especially because it was constructed during an economic downturn. The project was completed in 1830 and, like the South Portico, remains to this day. For several decades after Jackson, the White House saw relatively few major changes to its layout. Some recognizable interior details were added, including the decoration of the Red Room and its iconic color scheme for the first time in 1845, during the Polk presidency. If you watched my 7 Facts About Every President video, you might know that the first White House library was commissioned by 13th President Millard Fillmore and his wife, Abigail, in the year 1850. It was also during the Fillmore administration that the first bathtub was added to the White House. Franklin Pierce added a hot water furnace, a second-floor bathroom, and improved the plumbing in the 1850s. Okay, remember this painting from the 1860s that I showed a couple minutes ago? Well, this building to the left here is the first ever greenhouse on White House property, added in 1857 by the request of President James Buchanan's acting First Lady, Harriet Lane. It was used to grow flowers, which were subsequently used as a decoration around the rest of the property, often overseen personally by Lane herself. Plenty of future First Ladies followed in Lane's footsteps by working on major floral projects, including Jackie Kennedy's Rose Garden and Lady Bird Johnson's beautification of the White House. But don't worry, we'll get to all that a bit later. Sadly, this greenhouse was destroyed in an 1867 fire, but ended up being replaced with several other greenhouses on the west side of the property before the West Wing was added in 1902. Despite being one of the most transformative presidents in American history, Abraham Lincoln didn't really add that much to the White House at all. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. There were definitely bigger concerns he needed to attend to at the time. The expansion of the White House in any significant fashion would more than likely have been perceived as distasteful and poorly timed during the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and James A. Garfield, the next 4 presidents, continued the trend of not adding a whole lot to the White House during this era. Additional conservatories were added to the property in the 1870s and 1880s, like I mentioned, including rose houses, a camellia house, orchid houses, and a house for bedding plants. One of these conservatories even included a billiards room for Grant to hang out in during his free time. While Grant didn't make many exterior changes, he and his wife Julia did redecorate much of the interior, including modern chandeliers and Renaissance revival furniture. This was done in 1873 and 1874 in preparation for their daughter Nellie's wedding, which took place at the White House. However, Grant's successor, Rutherford B. Hayes, might have overseen the single most important change in White House history, the first ever Easter egg roll. In all seriousness, Hayes also added the first telephone and first typewriter to the White House, as well as modernized indoor plumbing. Garfield didn't add a whole lot either because, well, he was shot less than 4 months into his term. He did have an experimental air conditioning unit installed in his sick room, as well as a hydraulic elevator, which was sadly not completed until after his death. After a few decades of relatively minor changes at the White House, 21st President Chester Arthur decided it was time to switch things up big time. Arthur was obsessed with style and fashion, often changing his clothes several times throughout the day. This mentality seemed to carry over into his residence during his 3.5 years as president, undertaking a lavish redecoration of the White House's interior from 1881 to 1883. Designer Louis Comfort Tiffany, the same Tiffany as the iconic jewelry brand Tiffany & Co., was hired to redecorate with a high Victorian aesthetic. Arthur would constantly supervise the work being done and make personal suggestions. Over 20 wagon loads of furniture and accessories from before Arthur's presidency were auctioned off. The project was the most expensive the White House had seen since the Reconstruction following the War of 1812 fire. Like several other White House projects we mentioned so far, this was an extremely controversial measure at the time. Arthur was accused of turning the residence of a democratically elected leader into a palace for a king. Despite the controversy, the project was completed. The subsequent 2 decades were another time of relative stagnation in the evolution of the White House. The biggest development during this time came in the year 1891, during Benjamin Harrison's administration, in which electricity was added for the first time. Harrison was actually so scared of getting electrocuted from touching the light switch that he would sometimes go to bed with the lights on. Along with electricity came the installation of call bells, which could be used to summon the staff. Harrison proposed much larger expansions as well, including a historical art wing and a west wing to carry out official functions. Wait a second, that sounds a little familiar. Congress unfortunately denied his plans to expand the White House, but as you might be able to tell, some of these would come to fruition later on. The Harrisons also began the tradition of placing a Christmas tree in the White House every December, and Benjamin Harrison would even dress up as Santa Claus for his grandchildren. Presidents William McKinley and Grover Cleveland didn't change a whole lot either, with the biggest addition between the two being McKinley's update of the Blue Room. After the assassination of McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt ascended to the office of the presidency and decided it was time for a major change. The high Victorian redecoration that President Arthur and Louis Tiffany oversaw still remained controversial 2 decades later. Roosevelt, along with many others, believed that the interior decorations did not match the classical architecture of the exterior and sought out to revert the interior design to a more fitting one. He hired an architectural firm called McKim, Mead & White to carry out his proposed expansions and renovations, with the ambitious project being personally overseen by Charles McKim. The project began in 1902 and saw the removal of the greenhouses and conservatories I mentioned earlier, the construction of the West Wing, a new tennis court, and substituting many of Arthur's Victorian interiors with neoclassical ones. There were even accommodations made for automobile deliveries and staging posts, with the horse and carriage on its way to becoming obsolete. The first version of the East Wing was also created as a part of this process. However, this is not the same structure that's being demolished in 2025. The original East Wing functioned as an entrance hall for visitors, including plenty of cloakrooms. This would later be demolished by Roosevelt's distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, in 1942, and replaced with the version of the East Wing that lasted from then until 2025. But we'll get to that a bit later. Following along with the theme of this video, this was once again extremely controversial. The Washington Post described Roosevelt's project as an attempt to modernize the White House that has destroyed its historical value and does not seem to have made it much more desirable as a residence. The project cost several $1,000,000 in today's money, and despite its controversy, was completed. One last thing about Roosevelt's time in the White House. He was the one that made the name of the building official. Before then, it was actually called the Executive Mansion in an official capacity, although White House had been a nickname for it ever since the Reconstruction following the War of 1812. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, oversaw the addition of perhaps the most iconic interior section of the White House, the Oval Office. This is technically not the same Oval Office that's used today, but once again, we'll get to that a bit later. Regardless, the concept of the Oval Office remained the same, a central hub for the president to operate his day-to-day tasks from. The office was modeled after the Blue Room in the main building, which was, in a way, a callback to George Washington himself, who had originally suggested the rounded walls of that room. Architect Nathan Wythe was chosen to design it through winning a competition, once again harkening back to the origins of the White House itself. During Taft's time at 1600 Pennsylvania, he also converted the White House stables into a garage for the fleet of presidential automobiles. And yes, he did add an oversized bathtub, but never actually got stuck in it. Finally, Taft added a sleeping porch on top of the main structure, a screened-off area for him and his family. Between Taft's departure in the beginning of World War II, we enter another period of relatively smaller changes to the White House. Woodrow Wilson added the first projector to the building, which he infamously used to screen the Ku Klux Klan propaganda film Birth of a Nation in 1915. He did not add a movie theater to the White House, though. The film was screened in the East Room, with the theater not being added for almost 30 more years. His wife, Ellen Wilson, had the first rose garden planted in 1913, which would become an iconic staple of the White House grounds. In 1927, Calvin Coolidge and First Lady Grace Coolidge ordered the renovation of the attic of the main structure into a complete third floor. Additional measures for stability were added, including a steel and concrete roof. By Grace Coolidge's request, a sunroom facing the Potomac River was added, called the solarium or sky parlor, used as a private retreat for the first family. This served as a replacement to Taft's sleeping porch. Another accomplishment of Grace Coolidge regarding the White House was the passage of a congressional resolution that allowed for the acceptance of objects with great historical or cultural importance as gifts to a permanent White House collection. The subsequent president, Herbert Hoover, saw a major fire during his time in the White House. The fire significantly damaged the West Wing, and Hoover took the opportunity to renovate and improve the structure during the repair process. Over the course of 7 months, a second floor was added to the West Wing, the existing White House basement was enlarged, and new steel supports were constructed underneath the building. After Hoover was voted out in the 1932 election, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the president of the United States. Not only did he have major plans for the country, he had them for the White House as well. Like the other Roosevelt before him, FDR's administration would see some of the most drastic changes to the building yet. FDR expanded the size and influence of the executive branch, arguably the most out of any president in history, and with these expansions came a need for increased office space and conference areas for the new staff. The West Wing was completely rebuilt by architect Eric Googler, and plenty of recognizable features from the wing that still exist to this day were implemented. This includes the current location of the Oval Office, adjacent to the Rose Garden.
Do you know what I just realized? I'm doing the TV show The West Wing on Patreon. I've just realized why it's called The West Wing. That's terrible. That is bloody terrible. Okay.
Exist to this day were implemented. This includes the current location of the Oval Office, adjacent to the Rose Garden. Every president since FDR has redecorated in their own vision with varying degrees of change. After rebuilding and expanding the West Wing, Roosevelt's attention turned to the east. The entrance hall and cloakrooms that Theodore Roosevelt had built 40 years prior were torn down, and in its place, an expansive new structure was built. The 1942 East Wing still featured an entrance hall for visitors, but also contained 2 floors of offices and an underground air raid shelter. Remember, this was during World War II, and a state-of-the-art bunker to protect the highest-ranking American politicians was deemed a necessary expense by the administration at the time. Even with the 2025 demolition of FDR's East Wing, it seems like the bunker is still being kept mostly intact, but will reportedly receive security enhancements and integration into the new ballroom structure. During this project, the White House was also made into a wheelchair-accessible building to accommodate FDR's physical disability. Oh yeah, and the famous White House movie theater was added as a part of this renovation. Once again, the project was, you guessed it, very controversial. Many congressional Republicans criticized the expense of the construction and the secretive nature of it. But these days, the bunker is relatively uncontroversial and was seen as a necessity, especially during the Cold War era. Okay, for this next section, we're going to need to rewind about 10 minutes back in the video. Shortcuts had to be made to finish reconstruction in 3 years, including reusing some of the damaged walls from the fire, which would become a problem much later down the line. It's now the year 1948, and Harry Truman is now president after the death of FDR. Due to the haphazard reconstruction following the War of 1812, as well as a century and a half of various architects adding and removing segments of the building with little to no communication between one another, the White House was on the verge of collapse. Not some metaphorical political collapse like dramatic news headlines these days like to say. No, the White House was literally about to physically collapse. A 1941 report from the Army Corps of Engineers claimed that there was a crumbling wood structure and various fire hazards inside, which was ignored by FDR. During a formal reception in the Blue Room in 1946, First Lady Bess Truman noticed the large crystal chandelier above precariously swaying back and forth. Harry Truman humorously described a potential scenario in which the bathtub would fall through the ceiling with him wearing nothing more than his reading glasses. Funnily enough, he wasn't too far off, because in summer 1948, his daughter Margaret's piano crashed through the floor of her second-floor sitting room and through the ceiling of the family dining room, with a leg of the piano visible. The ceiling had sunk about 18 inches, or almost half a meter for my foreign viewers, and there was a serious danger that the rest of the second-floor ceiling would begin to sink along with it, especially on the west side. The Trumans were moved to the east side of the second floor, deemed to be the more stable side, while steel beams were added underneath the west side and later throughout the rest of the building. Oh yeah, the Truman balcony was also completed in 1948, an expansion on the south portico that remains to this day. Despite that being a relatively major addition, there were much bigger fish to fry. 1948 was an election year, and Truman was down in the polls. He wanted to keep the news of the White House collapse secret, so as to not invite any low-hanging fruit metaphors about the state of his administration itself. Truman ended up pulling off an election win in November, one of the biggest upsets in presidential history. On November 7th, 1948, just 5 days after the election, the news of the imminent collapse of the building was announced to the public. The Trumans vacated the building and moved across the street to the Blair House, and the entire main structure had all its furniture and decorations removed within 2 weeks. 3 possible outcomes were considered for this project. The first option was to keep the exterior facade, but demolish the interior and replace it with a new one. The second was to demolish the entire building altogether and build a new executive mansion in its place. Finally, the third option was to once again demolish the whole building, but reuse the components to rebuild a near-identical replica. The commission on the renovation of the executive mansion ended up choosing option 1, and things were officially set into motion for the biggest renovation the White House had ever seen. The budget was $5.7 million, which would be over $75 million in 2025 money. The entirety of the interior, except for the relatively recent third floor, was removed, with an attempt at preservation of the original items inside. During the demolition and reconstruction, Truman was heavily involved with overseeing the project. He even took pine from the house and had it made into paperweights, which he would give to his cabinet members as gifts. The public could buy bricks from the White House for $1, or about $13 today. Not bad. Like I mentioned before, the primary objective of the reconstruction was to increase the stability of the foundation of the building, which was heavily prioritized here. New foundations were implemented by reworking existing basement levels and adding 2 more, with a steel and concrete structure throughout. There was also the addition of modern windows, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, plumbing, electricity, you get the idea. The list of interior changes is too long to list here. In fact, the number of rooms inside the building nearly doubled with this renovation. It'd probably be easier to list what didn't change, which was pretty much just most of the third floor of the main building and most of the west wing. By far the most important change was the structural foundation. On March 27, 1952, the 28-month project came to an end when the Trumans moved back in, with less than a year left in Harry Truman's term to enjoy the new upgrades. Of course, this project was, once again, incredibly controversial. Probably the most out of any White House changes in American history. People were angry at the loss of the original interiors, the cost in the post-World War II environment, and just about every other debate you could imagine. Truman was even accused of misappropriating funds for personal gain. Surprisingly, the Truman balcony was actually one of the most controversial changes during this era. The balance between preservation and modernization was always going to be a very tricky one to pull off. As someone who loves history, it hurts my soul a little bit to see photos like this, but I see both sides of the argument. Upgrades were necessary in order for the White House to remain as a functional entity for decades to come, but I do think preservation should be prioritized whenever possible. Between Truman and Trump, there weren't a whole lot of fundamental changes to the White House itself. Like I previously mentioned, each president has added their own flair to the Oval Office, which has become somewhat of a tradition to redecorate upon the beginning of the new administration. While I'm on the subject, I'll throw up some pictures on screen now of the different Oval Offices throughout the years. I'd say I'm most partial to the Nixon, Clinton, and Biden Oval Offices. I'm a big fan of the blue and gold color combination. It's bold, but I think it works. Reagan's is solid too. The rose and the white also work pretty well together in my opinion. Okay, back to the changes of the White House itself. Like I said, there weren't too many between Truman and Trump, but there are still a few worth mentioning. Eisenhower was the first president to take a helicopter to and from the White House in the year 1957. Probably the most famous change made by a First Lady of the White House came in 1962, with Jackie Kennedy's redesign of the Rose Garden. The garden had existed since Edith Wilson planted it nearly 50 years prior, but wow, talk about a makeover. Not only did Jackie redesign the Rose Garden, she also gave the interior of the White House an upgrade too. Different historical styles were implemented in different rooms by Jackie alongside interior designer Stéphane Boudin, including a Louis XIV theme for the Yellow Oval Room and a Victorian theme for the President's Study. There was even a famous televised broadcast of Jackie giving a tour of the refurbished White House interior on Valentine's Day 1962. You can even log it on Letterboxd. Also during this time, the Committee for the Preservation of the White House was established, an institution which Jackie Kennedy was in strong support of. It operated pretty much exactly as you'd imagine, with an emphasis on limiting architectural changes and maintaining historical integrity. After the Kennedys came the Johnsons, and like Jackie Kennedy before her, Lady Bird Johnson made an effort to improve the beauty of the White House lawns and gardens. Her project was called the Society for a More Beautiful National Capital, which sought to not only improve the White House, but the entirety of Washington, D.C. Millions of flowers were planted across the city, and she dedicated both the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden and the Children's Garden on the White House South Lawn. The Nixons also made some small changes too, including the refurbishment of the green, blue, and red rooms by First Lady Pat Nixon, and the addition of the press briefing room above FDR's FDR's old swimming pool. Perhaps most famously, Nixon added a single-lane bowling alley to the basement. Following Nixon was Jimmy Carter, who in 1979 added solar panels on the White House roof in response to the ongoing energy crisis that were later removed in 1986 by the Reagan administration. The Reagans, specifically First Lady Nancy Reagan, redesigned the interior of the private family quarters, being described as glamour mixed with a homely touch. The new furnishings notably were funded by private donations instead of congressionally appropriated funds. The Clintons and the Bushes made some small interior changes as well, mainly refurbishing existing rooms. Barack Obama most famously converted the White House tennis court to a basketball court due to his love of the sport. And that brings us all the way up to the modern day. The latest White House project is the addition of Donald Trump's ballroom, which, like I mentioned in the intro to this video, has resulted in demolition of the East Wing facade that was primarily constructed in 1942. In the middle of me writing the script to this video, Trump has now said that the cost of the ballroom will be $300 million, which is being funded by private donors including Meta, Apple, and Google. Remember, since this is an ongoing project, some things I say here are subject to change, so feel free to provide updates in the comments if that ends up being the case. The ballroom will be about 90,000 square feet and accommodate upwards of 1,000 people, which is significantly larger than the main building of the White House itself. I'll let President Trump explain the intended functionality of the ballroom in his own words.
It's about $300 million. You can see this. This is a plan. If it's got tables so that you honor a foreign leader, we have a proper space. Right now, we have a space that with tables holds about 79 people. This is an interior shot of the ballroom. I think there'll be nothing like it. That's an interior of the ballroom. Over the years, many presidents have made changes. This obviously would be the biggest change. This is going to be probably the finest ballroom ever built, and we're doing it no cost to the country. It's being the money's being put in by me and donors.
Previously, major White House events were held primarily in the East Room, which is only a fifth of the capacity of the new ballroom, or outside in tents on the South Lawn. Speaking of outside, another change Trump made to the White House was paving over the rose garden grass, which you can see here. The ballroom project is on a timeline to be completed before Trump's second term ends on January 20th, 2029. It has been described as big enough to hold an inauguration ceremony, so who knows, we might see the 48th president inaugurated inside the ballroom a few years from now. Like so many other White House construction projects we've talked about today, this is an incredibly controversial project. The divide seems to mostly be a partisan one, and I'm sure pretty much everyone watching this video has already made up their mind on it. All I ask is that we try to be respectful towards one another in the comments. So there you have it, a brief history of the White House modifications and expansions since its initial construction over 2 centuries ago. What would you say your favorite addition was? I think I'd have to go with the underground bunker. I've had a huge fascination with subterranean construction projects ever since I visited the catacombs in Paris back when I was in high school. If you enjoyed what you saw today, please consider subscribing. This video marks the end of President's Month here on the channel, with this being the 5th and final President's related video in the month of October. Spoiler alert, my next video is also President's related, but it'll be a bit on the longer side and more than likely take a couple weeks to complete. If that sounds interesting to you, I'll see you then. This is Bay State History, signing off.
So, obviously from that, there's a lot of changes that's happened to the White House over the years, and each time it's thrown up controversy, which you can understand. You know, a lot of people like to keep that history. A lot of people don't like change. A lot of people like to see, you know, the same thing that they, you know, knew in the past. So, but whatever you do, it's always going to be controversial for sure. So I don't know anything about the ballroom. I don't really know anything, as I said, about the White House at all. But interesting, it's seen a lot of changes. Even all the insiders, you know, upgraded, crumbling White House. Man, that's pretty scary. Bloody pianos falling through floors and whatever else. That's pretty scary for sure. But, you know, a lot of people have had different ideas when they've, you know, become president, what they want to do with it and whatever else. So, and I'm sure there'll be more changes after Trump, you know, comes out of office as well too. So who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? But it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. This new ballroom meant to be done, 3 years or whatever else they were saying. So, but I'm sure it'll be controversial like everything else. But it'll be interesting to see what it looks like too. And, you know, having a small space as they have now to be able to hold, you know, up to 1,000 people, that's a lot of people. But I guess if you go into the, as they say, the most powerful country in the world, why not have somewhere where you can go and, you know, entertain and actually be able to fit all those people in there comfortably too. So I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comment section, guys. Thank you very much for joining us today. Make sure you stay safe, and I'll definitely see you in the next reaction video. Oh, you're still here? You want more content? Why don't you check out my Patreon down here? You'll get plenty more content and some exclusive videos over there too. If not, why not check out this one over here?